On Monday, the 44th Parliament will get started, and to help break it all down, I'm joined by the CBC's Aaron Wherry. Hey, Aaron, how you doing?
Hey, Eric, how are you?
So there's been a lot going on, and so my first question is a big one. When it comes to Justin Trudeau's minority government, what does the PEI by-election, what impact will that have?
I mean, obviously, as PEI goes, so goes the nation. So I assume that the federal parties are poring over that data right now, trying to figure out how to recalibrate their policies in light of how the voters in PEI have moved.
All right. Well, I'm glad you took that seriously. Okay, so it is the return of Parliament next week, and we'll get to maybe the Liberals and the New Democrats. But so as a word of warning, we are recording this on Wednesday midday, and as we're recording it, the Conservatives are actually holding their caucus, which is minus one person, Denise Batters, who was booted from the caucus on Tuesday night. Now, we don't really know how this is all going to play out. So by the time you're listening to this, there might be some new developments. But generally speaking, do you think Erin O'Toole is in a lot of trouble here?
He's definitely not in a little trouble. I mean, I don't know that this is like the end of him necessarily, or the beginning of the end, but anytime you have to toss somebody out of caucus, because they challenged your leadership, you're in a pretty tough spot. And I think it depends on how this plays now, whether this sort of solidifies his position, because it sort of sends a message that he's not playing around, and anyone who was going to support Batters or was thinking of supporting Batters kind of walks away or gets cold feet, or whether this just emboldens everyone. Like it kind of feels like he wanted to accelerate the fight, the confrontation. Like, okay, if you guys are going to come at me and you're going to do this petition, and you've got this plan to drag it out for 6 months, and new people are going to be popping up every couple of weeks, like, let's just do it right now. I'll toss Batters out, and let's see if we can get this confrontation over with. And that could work out if he's got the numbers. If there really aren't that many people behind Batters, then maybe he's fine. But he may now find out that there are a bunch of people behind her, in which case he's in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, the reporting I last saw was something along the lines of 70 MPs they have at least lined up that would vote to boot out anybody who was supporting Batters, but that does still leave nearly 50 MPs. And I mean, if there was some sort of revolt that explodes and a dozen of them were having to be booted from the party, I mean, at that point you have a full-blown crisis going on. It is like, in a way, it is a bluff that if they don't call it, he's in a good spot. But if that bluff is called, I mean, that could be it, right?
Yeah, like it does feel like he's calling the bet. And you're right, like it's not, this isn't a 50+1 kind of situation, right? Like, it's not like, well, if he has half a caucus, he's fine. If he has less than like 80% of caucus, he's in trouble, right? Like that, people start going, well, how strong is your leadership? How can you possibly carry on? And it's just gonna even if he keeps going, like, even if he manages to get through this, it's gonna be a rough patch, because every time he steps in front of a microphone, the first question is going to be about what's going on inside his caucus. With Parliament coming back, the big, in addition to the throne speech and everything else, the next question is going to be how many Conservative MPs aren't going to show up to sit in Parliament because they're not vaccinated. He's got all these issues he's got to deal with, and they aren't going to go away. And so maybe in that sense, it makes sense to sort of just accelerate the confrontation and try to sort of get this over with. But it is a bet. It is a risky bet that he's got the numbers on his side.
This does seem like it's a bit more confrontational and dramatic than with Andrew Scheer. With Andrew Scheer, it was more like some whispering in the background. It was some leaked things about the private schools and who was paying for it. I don't remember it being as overt in 2019, but in a way, Erin O'Toole is taking action. And if he does just snuff it out in the first couple of months, maybe he can hold on for a long time. But this does seem a little bit more dramatic than back in 2019.
It does. Like, to my memory, at least, there was like an initial period of all eyes on Andrew Scheer. Is he possibly going to be able to remain as leader? Is he the problem? And then it kind of quieted down. And then there was the revelations about expenses and his, what he'd been doing with party funds, and that kind of blew up. And that was kind of quick. His end kind of came very quickly, or all of a sudden. And this in with O'Toole, I think there was like a bit of, I think I was a bit surprised that there wasn't an immediate rush to push him out in the first couple of weeks after the election. But now it seems like it's really building and moving, and it does feel like it's more of a real fight between kind of people who want to stick with O'Toole and people who maybe want to go in a different direction.
You wrote about this on the CBC website about the challenges that the Conservatives are facing, because while this is all about Erin O'Toole, it is really more about an existential question for the Conservatives that, he ran as someone on the right of the party, and then he campaigned as a person who was on the left of the party. And there's that question about whether anybody can bridge that gap. And Denise Batters, who I believe was supporting Peter MacKay, would have presumably been more on the side, would have been happy to see this kind of campaign run by Peter MacKay, but getting to that question of authenticity and everything. But there are some bigger problems here for the Conservatives, whether or not Erin O'Toole remains as leader.
Yeah, there's sort of two things going on here, right? One is that Erin O'Toole campaigned as one thing for the leadership race and then campaigned as something else for the general election. And there really isn't much of a tradition of that in recent Canadian political history, and he's sort of suffering for that now. But the other problem is that the reason presumably that he tried two different strategies here is because the Conservative Party base and the Conservative Party is on one side of many debates, and the general electorate is on the other, on gun control, on vaccine mandates, on climate change. There's sort of a general consensus on the issues, and then there's a conservative view of things. And figuring out how to win the party and then win the general electorate, that challenge is going to be there no matter who they put in as leader. And they really do. I think they really are running up against kind of a roadblock where you maybe can't win the party leadership without being kind of a hard doctrinaire conservative, and you can't win a general election without being a moderate. And so if that's the case, how do they win elections? And how does a viable general election candidate ever win the party leadership?
Yeah, and I mean, there was some Conservatives who would say that the reason that the Conservatives have been losing or lost under Erin O'Toole is that, if they run as a centrist party, then voters who are moderates will prefer the centrist party. But I'm not sure if it's as simple as that, right? Because a lot of the PPC vote, for example, probably wasn't going to be voting for a Conservative who was just slightly more to the right. And the Liberals didn't run a particularly good campaign in this case, and the Conservatives still just came up short. There's a lot of bigger questions here, and when you think about the Conservative Party throughout its history, it's always been this challenge of combining these different elements of the coalition, and they've managed to do it for a couple of elections. Brian Mulroney got the West and nationalist Quebecers in the 80s. You had Diefenbaker, who was pretty much doing the same thing, but it all just kind of falls apart after a little while. So what is the lasting kind of recipe for the Conservatives in this if the parts of the party can't seem to hold on and stick together long enough to win more than an election?
Yeah, there's this funny, like when you listen to what Denise Batters says about O'Toole, there's almost this suggestion that, oh, well, he went to the center, he became moderate, and that's why we lost. And that doesn't, if that's the conclusion they come away with on this, I don't know that they're in a better position going forward. Like, I do think he has some liabilities in that, his authenticity, I know people may roll their eyes at that, but like his authenticity is going to be questioned because of the kind of changing positions he's had on things. And so that may be a problem going forward with him in the next federal election. But I just don't know if the Conservatives can look at this and go, well, look, we tried carbon pricing and we still lost, so now we should go back to opposing carbon pricing. Like I that doesn't seem like a winning formula. That seems like the wrong way of reading this message. And it still seems to me that you would know the math better than me, but they can lose 10 points in Alberta so long as they make up 5 or 10 points in Ontario. Like they've still got more room to give up on the right than they have already. Like the trade-off still seems to be there, that if you have to give up on the right to get Ontario and get Quebec and get Atlantic Canada, that's still the better trade-off. That's still how the math works to get them back into government.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll see what happens with this. If they do get into another leadership race, which direction the party is going to go. If Aaron O'Toole remains as leader, does he remain as leader saying, we're continuing with this approach, or are we going back to trying to be a bit more conservative, shore up the base? I mean, the idea of it, authenticity, and I agree with you, like that, I think this is a big issue. And while it might seem like it's not a big issue, I mean, voters are smart enough, right? It's, running to win a leadership one way and then running in a general election in another way might seem like this clever strategic ploy, but people can pick that up, and it makes them wonder which of those was true, right? Did you fool the members to get the leadership, or are you trying to fool me now to become the prime minister? I think that is a specific issue for Erin O'Toole, but it would become an issue as well for any other leader who tried to do this in order to win the leadership, but run differently to win the general.
Right. Yeah. I still think, it's also possible, I think, here to overrate how much the leader necessarily matters. Like it's the Conservatives, like the Liberals kind of got into a situation between 2006 and 2012, 2013, where they just thought, well, if we just change the leader, like eventually we'll find the right one and we'll break through. And granted, they did get lucky when they got a pretty singular candidate in Justin Trudeau. And a lot of what they accomplished in 2015, you can trace back to sort of who Trudeau is and his unique appeal. But they also, like, their offer in 2015 was fundamentally different than what they'd offered in 2011 and 2008. Like their platform, their policy, their approach to things had changed. Trudeau came in and made some big moves about, deciding the party was going to be strictly pro-choice, kicking senators out, promising to legalize marijuana, focusing on the middle class. Like it wasn't just that they changed leaders and that's how they got back into government. You do have to go back to kind of the first principles and figure out what your party's about and figure out where the electorate is. And figure out how to get to your party to where the electorate is. And I just don't know that the Conservatives have yet gotten to that part of the conversation.
Yeah, a lot of the discussion I've heard from Conservatives who are supporting Erin O'Toole publicly have said, that we need to focus on being a good opposition party. And that role is, very important in our democracy. But at the same time, if you're a party trying to get into power and you're focusing on the opposition aspect rather than the offer to becoming a government, I think that is also, part of the problem, that the Conservatives do need to have a good offer in the next election. Eventually, you can win an election just by not being the government, right?
Right.
But
right.
That is not a long-term strategy for success.
Right. Yeah, and you're right about the opposition thing too, right? Like the last leader of the official opposition to become prime minister was Stephen Harper. And we've had several now try their luck and fail. And you go back again to 2015. Everybody said, oh, Tom Mulcair is an excellent opposition leader. He's a really excellent opposition leader. He has so much credibility, he's so strong in the House. And that didn't really seem to amount for much when it came to a general election because the Liberals had the better offer. And the Conservatives do need to be able to focus on being an opposition and hammering away at the government. But and you're right, you will get a lucky eventually, and the incumbent government will wear itself out, and the public will want to change, and they'll go for whoever happens to be around. But you do have to go out most of the time. You do have to go out and actually win the election with something proactive and forward thinking. And so, regardless of who the Conservative, like whether it's O'Toole in the next election or another Conservative, unless the Conservatives can kind of deal with the fundamental questions that go right through their party, they won't necessarily be in a better position if they switch leaders.
So on the podcast, I take questions from people, and there was one that I thought I'd actually bring up here because it talks, it's about these leadership things. This was from Christopher J, and he said, Would we ever see an Australian-style leadership spill in Canadian politics, where a caucus could appoint a leader? Do we have the mechanisms in party rules to do it? I think you and I have actually talked about this before, but in Australia, the caucus can and has in several times in just a number of years.
Every 6 months or so, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. They replace their leader, but it's driven by the caucus. We don't really have that here, but I think technically, because of the Reform Act, the Conservative caucus, if they wanted to, could remove Aaron O'Toole as leader, but he would still technically be the leader of the Conservative Party, because there isn't a mechanism within the private organization that is the Conservative Party Canada to follow what the parliamentary caucus says.
Yeah, there's sort of two. Yeah, you're dealing with two different things, right? You're dealing with caucus and you're dealing with the political party. I believe the caucus. I'd have to go back, and you didn't prepare me for this question, Eric, so I didn't do my homework. I believe the Reform Act allows for caucus to appoint an interim leader. It might. I can't remember, but so caucus could vote out could do a straight vote and get rid of O'Toole, or declare him not to be the leader. I mean, at that point, it's kind of academic, right? Like if there's if 50% of your caucus says you should go, the rest of the party is probably going to decide, yeah, you should probably step aside. Your position is probably untenable. It might get dragged out for longer than it needs to be, and it might be more painful for everyone. But it's sort of whether or not it's the caucus who officially votes you out or not. It's not necessarily the biggest distinction, because one way or another, if you don't have the support, you're not going to be leader for very long.
Yeah. So the answer is it's not really a mechanism that exists in Canada, but in effect, it would have the same impact. But we haven't really seen a lot of cases where the caucus is overturning a leader. I can't recall the last. Well, I mean, it happened with the Bloc not a couple of years ago.
Right.
But often the caucus kind of doesn't want to weigh in that much.
No, there was the Stockwell Day situation, but things have to get pretty dire for caucus to decide to play the nuclear option, because again, like all the incentives sort of are on the side of keeping everyone together and keeping everyone on side, because even if you're a caucus member and you think your leader's terrible, that triggering a leadership change or a confrontation is going to have ramifications for you personally within the party, but also going to have ramifications for your party to the rest of the country. And if the rest of the country thinks your party is a basket case, then your own chances of being elected are going to suffer. So these things do happen. There will be points where the pressure internally or the disputes are too much and they force a party leader out, but there's a lot of incentive to kind of stick together and try to ride it out.
Yeah, I think a lot of MPs or MLAs or whatever prefer to have someone else make that decision, and at least publicly. If the members can do it, it's better.
Yeah, there's a lot of like deferring. Well, if the party wants, if the members, the grassroots want to do this, then obviously we must listen to the grassroots. And nobody wants to sort of stick their neck out for maybe obvious reasons. I mean, we'll see in the current situation now that Erin O'Toole sort of drawn a line in the sand, okay, well, how many people want to get up and stand up and say, I side with Denise Batters. It's time for Erin O'Toole to go. We will. It's a bit of a test of courage at this point.
So let's move on to the other parties in the House, including the governing party. Yes, they're less interesting though. So we're going into Parliament returning. There'll be a throne speech. There was this discussion about the Liberals and the New Democrats potentially working together in some informal or formal way to make Parliament work. Aaron O'Toole started talking about a coalition, which was never really on the table. And Jagmeet Singh said, no, we're not going to do a coalition, despite no one offering that to him. But from what I can see, that it doesn't seem like that has gone much further than just some discussions, and I guess they'll play it out from vote to vote as usual.
Yeah, it doesn't seem. I mean, I do suspect that there were conversations, and it came up, and it was sort of floated and considered on both sides, and maybe they're still considering it, but it's not the comparison point is 2008 when the Liberals and the NDP actually did form a coalition. Tried, yes. They at least put something in writing. But in that case, so there was a couple of things. One is like, if you look at how that came together, there were negotiating teams and all sorts of back channel conversations, and they were sitting down and hashing out terms, and there was lots of back and forth, and it was very formal, really. There were distinct negotiating teams on each side, and there was lots of they were getting down to discussing very specific terms, and so that hasn't happened in this case, which suggests that it's not very far along. And the other thing that's different about 2008 now is that there was it was time sensitive, right? They needed to move fast because they thought they were only going to get one shot at Harper. They never even got that shot, but they needed to move fast to try to replace the government that was in office. And in this case, there really isn't an impetus to move fast and get something done. And so I think it's possible that this plays out longer, and that maybe discussions sort of happen, they see how things play out, and then maybe they come to some terms later. But it doesn't feel like there is a big rush to get something done right now, or that they are even so far along that they're down to those terms. I mean, I do think eventually, either for these two parties or for two parties in the future, it's going to make sense to do something like this. But it's not quite clear that we're quite at the point where everybody wants to admit that this would be a smart way to do things or a better way to do things.
Right. And also, if we are, as I think you've written about too, in an era where minority parliaments are more likely, it might take a few more before the parties realize that we do need some sort of mechanism to make this work, rather than just to have this, white knuckling it for a couple of years just to avoid an election. And I mean, in this case, the Liberals don't really need to do this. It would have made things easier for them in the House. Maybe they could have gotten some more helpful committees and get things passed through the House a bit more quickly. But I, from the NDP's perspective, how much were they really going to get that they probably aren't going to already get anyway, because there's not that much difference between the NDP and the Liberals on the things they agree about. Right.
Yeah. That's the piece that I find hardest to figure out, just in the hypothetical, is the NDP would want to come away with one or two things that they can say, oh, the Liberals wouldn't have done that if not for us. Like, that's a distinct thing where we got the Liberals to do something. And I don't know what the Liberals would be willing to give them exactly. On some of the issues, like a wealth tax, pharmacare, they don't feel like something that the Liberals necessarily want to go, okay, we'll change our position, we'll change our approach, and we'll give it to you right now, and we'll do exactly what you want. And so I don't know that. So I can see the Liberals sitting back and telling themselves, we don't really need to do this. One way or another, one of these parties is going to be either willing to support us or willing to stand down, and we'll continue to advance our agenda. And the NDP can say, there's probably not enough in it for us. There's a lot of debt, there's some risk. If we get into a deal with the Liberals, it might, we might end up looking kind of irrelevant, and that we don't matter, and that, the Liberals may get all the credit for whatever gets done over the next few years. And meanwhile, you have the Conservatives saying, "Oh, look, the coalition's back, and they're going to spend us into the poorhouse, and this kind of backroom dealing is bad." So, like, it feels like there's still lots of maybe reasons to be hesitant about doing a deal. But as you said, like, I do think if we are in a minority parliament era, if we are going to have minority governments for the foreseeable future, or that they're going to be the rule rather than the exception, the sort of white knuckling, week to week, day to day, are you going to throw out force an election? Are you going to force an election? What are you going to do? Vote against us? That kind of daring, the game of chicken that goes on throughout minority parliaments traditionally, I just don't think it's sustainable. And I think at some point, parties and the public are going to have to kind of cross the threshold and realize that, making formal agreements and ensuring that Parliament functions for 2 or 3 years or 4 just just makes sense. And the kind of constant turmoil isn't really good for anybody.
We'll have to see, I suppose, how this one works out, right? If it is a dysfunctional parliament, then maybe that'll be the lesson that the parties might draw from it. If it works okay, maybe they continue this way. For the NDP, the results from the election weren't as good as they could have been, or as they would have liked. But I do think they got some mileage out of the notion of, if we weren't there, the Liberals wouldn't have done this. So I think they got something out of it in a way that maybe if they were like in a Lib Dem kind of situation, like with the coalition that happened in the UK, that maybe it would have been a harder sell. But maybe that's where they're coming from, that is a more effective line than just being a junior quote unquote partner.
Yeah, the thinking is, generally speaking, right, the junior partners kind of end up suffering at the next election because they don't get any of the credit for any of the things that get done. I would wonder, though, whether there would be a way for the NDP to do this and come away with a bit more credibility as a party that can govern. I don't know that you can draw a straight line and from what happened in Ontario, but in Ontario in '85, the Liberals and the NDP make a deal. And the Liberals are the bigger party, so the NDP is the third party, just as they are, or well, now I guess maybe they're the fourth party. But the NDP is the junior partner, quote unquote, in that deal in '85. And the Liberals in the next election, David Peterson's Liberals, do get all the credit and they win a majority. But then when David Peterson makes the mistake of calling an early election, it's the NDP that goes into government next, and that's the only time the NDP has ever governed in Ontario. And so I would wonder whether, the experience of seeing the NDP have a hand in government in '85 helped make the case for them down the road. And I would wonder whether the NDP, given where they are right now, as sort of being that, the party, they're sort of only not really even arguing that they should be government so much that they should just be kind of a presence. I wonder if that could, if joining a deal would help them kind of make the case that they're credible and capable of governing in the future.
For the Liberals, so they'll have a throne speech, which I guess the last one was just about a year ago. Are you expecting anything very different from what we saw from the Liberals in the spring or before the election, or is this going to be a continuation kind of thing?
I don't think so. I mean, the Liberals haven't done it. The Trudeau government has done a ton of throne speeches, but when they have done them, with the exception of the sort of immediate post-pandemic one, they've kind of been fairly straightforward, right? Like, here's what we promised to do during the campaign, and here's what now we're going to do them. And so I don't know that there's going to be a bunch of big surprises in the throne speech that they're going to start throwing new promises out there, especially because they've already got a lot of things they need to do. I suspect this will be a fairly straightforward recitation of what they promised in the campaign and what was still left to do from the last parliament. So maybe not the most exciting throne speech, as exciting as throne speeches are ever.
Yeah, on a scale of 0 to 10, throne speeches are maybe a 2. So you're saying this one might be a 1.
This might be, yes, one of the least exciting, less exciting. But I just don't know that they have so many things they need to do. There are bills that didn't get through the last parliament. There are commitments they made in 2019 that they couldn't get to because of the pandemic. And now there's a whole new platform in 2021 that they have to implement, which again makes the case for trying to find some stability in this parliament. But I don't know that they, I don't think it would be particularly wise for them to be, and now here's a bunch of new ideas that we didn't even promise in the election that we're also going to do. They just aren't in a position to start promising new things. They have a laundry list of things they still have to get through.
Well, unless they decide they need to react to the PC win in PEI in that by-election, maybe they'll have to move.
We have heard the people of Prince Edward Island, and here is how we shall respond. Yes, it's possible. It's very possible.
All right. Well, that's something to watch. All right. Well, thanks very much, Aaron. 44th Parliament starting on Monday, and we're expecting fireworks probably not in the House, outside the House, as the Conservative Party goes through a little bit of a time.
A little bit of a turbulence.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, Aaron.
Thanks, Eric.